Welcome everyone to our 2024 series of OTF Connects webinars. My name is Peter Beans and I'm honored to be your moderator for today's session with Olivia Pellegrino entitled Building Integrated Curriculum to Support Intermediate Literacy and Language Skills. Before we begin, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge first and foremost that we are gathered in the province of Ontario on the traditional territories of various Indigenous peoples who have been present on this land known as Turtle Island since time immemorial. We acknowledge that this has been a meeting ground for generations. We are grateful to the stewards and caretakers of this land. As advocates, teachers, and educators, we understand our collective responsibility to honor, protect, and sustain this land. We further recognize and honor within the membership of OTF those who are Indigenous to this land. This practice of recognizing the ancestral and traditional lands in which we work, live, and play is a concrete action that we undertake as a first step towards reconciliation between Canadians and the Indigenous peoples of this land. But it is not our only step. Collectively and individually, we must seek to denounce the injustices and wrongs that have been committed against the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and to dedicate ourselves to cultivating and maintaining relationships based on mutual respect and truth. And with that, I would like to introduce Olivia Pellegrino. Olivia is a special education teacher and education researcher with an interdisciplinary background in English literature and health studies. She has worked in both K-12 and post-secondary education and is currently teaching in a grade 7-8 gifted classroom. Olivia's work in education is focused on developing creative and practical pedagogies rooted in cultural competencies and the principles of gamification. As a teacher, coach, and mentor, Olivia's passion include curriculum development, coaching volleyball, cross-curricular literacy, and developing STEAM capabilities in educators and students. And with that, let's turn it over to Olivia.
And thank you all for being here this evening at what is a busy time of year, although I feel like as teachers, we can say that at any point in the year that it's quite busy. So welcome to this session, Building Integrated Curriculum to Support Language and Literacy Development. I will start by saying that my session is kind of designed to be about an hour and a half. So we may go until about close to 6 o'clock, but if you do need to pop out at 5:30, please do. I'd like to honor your time. And so I will also move as quickly as I can while still honoring the material. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here and to be learning alongside you. At any point, if you wanted to ask questions or add comments, please feel free to use the chat throughout the presentation. Like I said, I'm excited to learn together. So I want to just confirm that you can see my slides and that they are changing.
We can.
Lovely. Peter, thank you for that wonderful land acknowledgement. I wanted to give my own because it is, I think, significant and important for me to do so. I am joining from Hamilton this evening, which is Treaty 3 territory. And I wanted to share as well, because I'm going to be talking about a lot of project-based learning this evening. And one of the project-based learning pieces for integrated curriculum that I worked on last year with a grade 8 class was to work with our Indigenous education advisor, work with elders in our community to research and write and do the art for and present a land acknowledgement that was specific to our school and our students. And a call to action for our school community. And so because I'm going to be talking about PBL a lot this evening, I wanted to start with sharing this example as something authentic and socially motivated, and a way that we can turn saying a land acknowledgement into creating actions and opportunities for reconciliation and action. So that is that. Welcome again. I am so excited and grateful for you to be here today. And I am going to ask that if you haven't already, please share your name, organization, grades, or staff that you support in the chat if you feel comfortable doing so. It's great to get a sense of who is attending, just for my own personal interest. But also, this is a session geared mostly towards intermediate because I am an intermediate teacher, and I am sharing experiences based on my learning as an intermediate teacher. However, I am very confident in saying that the principles that we are discussing this evening are something that can be applicable to any grade at any time in any subject area or multiple subject areas at once. Hence the idea of integrated curriculum. Now, I have lost my ability to see the chat now that I'm sharing my screen, but that is okay. I'll figure that out in a moment.
I'm keeping an eye on it.
Perfect. So I'll start with sharing objectives of the webinar. So first and foremost, I want us to understand the importance of language and literacy across subject areas. I used to teach high school English before I was an intermediate teacher, and I also taught English at the University of Toronto for a few years. And it's a vastly different experience being an English teacher in high school and being a language arts teacher in elementary school, because in high school English, you are teaching literature, right? And you are teaching a specific set of skills. While in the intermediate grades, right, we do sometimes silo our subjects, right? Language arts is language arts, math is math, science is science. I've tried to get away from that because I do think that it's important that students develop literacy across subject areas. There's reading and writing in science, there's reading and writing in math, there's reading and writing in geography and history and art. And so how can we help our students understand the value of language and literacy in those subject areas? We also need to understand the value of language and literacy in those subject areas. I'd like us to have an opportunity to develop practical strategies for integrating literacy across various disciplines. So I will be talking a lot about PBL and integrative curriculum, and I'm going to try to focus on where language and literacy can appear in those examples that I'm giving you. I have a few tools and resources that I'd love to share for building and implementing cross-curricular literacy. And then we will also reflect on and acknowledge that there are both benefits to and challenges to implementing an integrative approach to curriculum. It's not all sunshine and rainbows and puppies. There are some real challenges, and it can be a bit of a slog. And so I do want to acknowledge that as well. And we'll get into it. So first and foremost, right, integrated curriculum is this complex and multifaceted notion that can have different meanings and different tiers, so to speak, right? Curriculum integration is an approach to teaching. And it is very likely that many of us, most of us, if not all of us, are already doing some sort of integrative curriculum, whether we recognize it or not, especially in our literacy instruction, because language is so ubiquitous and it does impact everything that we teach. So for example, I am currently working on a cross-panel study for math. So we're looking at grade 7, 8, and 9 math as a continuum, and we're focusing on fractions. And so I was in a grade 9 class doing some observation just last week, and it was a lesson on multiplying fractions using area models. It's super fun. I love it. It's my favorite way to multiply fractions. But as I was watching a group of grade 9 students work through this problem, they were able to do it super easily because they drew the rectangle, they split it up, and they found the length times width, they found the area, and the answer was 3/5. And then I asked them, 3/5 of what? And they were like, Good question. Let's go back to this word problem. And it took them a few minutes to parse. Was it, 3/5 of the wall that was being painted or 3/5 of the can of paint? Because of the language, right? So that key literacy piece, right, to understanding what the question is asking in math, for instance, right? Language is everywhere, literacy is everywhere, and it's important for us to note that. Right, so that kind of teaching, right, math word problems, that's kind of, that's an example of integrated curriculum, right, where you need literacy skills to answer a math problem. But there are ways to kind of zhuzh it up, so to speak, okay? And a myriad of ways to put integrative curriculum into practice that go further than just kind of smushing two subject areas together. So a couple of key points here that I wanted to sort of use as a baseline for this discussion. One is that integrated curriculum is a vast term with many approaches but what they all have in common is that they move away from conventional subject separation, all the way to the other end of the continuum where there's like no clearly defined subject areas being taught at all, right? And it's just work, okay? It's just learning. So full disclosure, where I'm located on this continuum that we'll talk about is in my own classroom. We do have structured periods for math, science, language, and geography. Those show up on my daily agenda, my daily schedule, and tend to be direct instruction, but only take up about 25 to 30% of the time that I spend with my class, where the rest of the time we are working on an integrative model. And I'll show you what that looks like in my classroom today. And hopefully we'll be able to work together to kind of come up with a picture or a plan for how you might bring this back to your own classroom, to your own school. So the Ministry of Education, especially with the release of the new language curriculum, has emphasized integrated curriculum as a key component, right? Just a couple of things that I've pulled out of the new ministry documents on the language curriculum. I'm going to quote now. Creative and critical thinking are at the heart of learning in all subject areas. So for example, in science, students consider diverse perspectives as they develop innovative, ethical, and effective solutions to societal and environmental problems. And I'm also going to just silo in there, if you're teaching grade 7 geography, that is also there's a sustainability piece in there, and grade 8 geography. So intermediate geography, you've got that sustainability piece. So you kind of got that alignment between science, language, math, or sorry, science, language, geography curriculum. Also from the ministry, in cross-curricular learning, students are provided with opportunities to learn and use related content and/or skills in 2 or more subjects. For example, teachers can use social studies texts in their language lessons and incorporate instruction in how to read and view nonfiction texts into their social studies lessons. In mathematics, students learn to apply their language and literacy skills to extract and interpret relevant information from a variety of representations, such as a table, a graph, an equation, etc. So what that shows us, right, in both of those pieces, we see that it's a skill. Language and literacy are a skill that is being emphasized rather than a piece of concrete knowledge. And this is key, I think, to understanding the importance of integrated curriculum for language. We're not necessarily teaching the novel. We're not necessarily teaching the essay or the presentation or poetry. Rather, we can teach any one of those things or any mix of those things through emphasizing a set of thinking skills that are required to parse those things and are transferable to other subject areas. Finally, and on a more personal level, I do believe that integrative curriculum, for me at least, is about joy. It's about finding something that students love, that students care about, that makes them excited to learn, and then using that jumping off point in order to have them develop skills, learn material, and of course be assessed across all of our subject areas. So when we're talking about that continuum of integrative curriculum, I thought it might be helpful to highlight and illuminate a few key places where applications of integrated teaching have diverged. So in multidisciplinary integrative curriculum or correlated teaching, this is an approach that recognizes disciplines have their own specific knowledge and their own specific skills. So we might plan a unit around a theme. For example, I might plan a unit around electricity if I'm in grade 6, or I might plan a unit around sustainability or ecosystems in grade 7 science. My learning goals for that unit are formulated from each discipline that's relevant to the unit. So I am taking science expectations, I'm taking some language expectations. And those units tend to be taught in separate subject blocks that parallel one another. So there is a science lesson about ecosystems, and then there is a language task about ecosystems. So the topic is the same, but the subjects are still sort of siloed. Each discipline is given its own spotlight. An interdisciplinary approach is one in which the disciplines start to share that spotlight. So in an interdisciplinary approach, a teacher might review curriculum for their grade overall and find meaningful overlaps in the big ideas of that curriculum. So for example, in the intermediate grades, you can make the clear interdisciplinary connection between the data strand in math and the creating texts strand in English. So you have an infographic that is in the math curriculum that can also be a language task. Researching, drafting, creating a text that shows the relationship between visual elements and words. That is an interdisciplinary task. So the emphasis there is on how the disciplines complement each other. So how the knowledge and skills of managing data and statistics can also help develop the skill of reading data, being literate in data, right? Creating a text that shows data. And then just for fun, my class is doing infographics now. And so math, language, and I threw it in there. I'm like, your topic has to come from the geography curriculum. So 3 birds, 1 stone. It's great. Finally, a transdisciplinary approach, is one that does require a restructuring of the way we think about curriculum. And usually that requires a restructuring of our daily teaching practices. This is where project-based learning comes in. And if you're already doing PBL, sorry, I'm going to probably repeat a lot of what you know, but PBL is a super great example, project-based learning, PBL, of a transdisciplinary approach, because we as educators are ceding a significant amount of control and a significant amount of direct instruction to instead focus on a large problem or large issue and one big question. And our big question becomes, what do my students need to know in order to complete this project? Often, the question is best answered in collaboration with students. So the project comes first, and the curriculum connections are kind of made in consultation with students and your own expertise as an educator. So PBL has, for a very long time, been posited as this means of increasing student engagement and increasing student achievement because it allows learners to align their interests with issues important to them, right? So they may end up doing math and not realize that they're doing math. which is great for some students, or they may end up doing language and not realizing that they're doing language. And that can be really awesome, because I think sometimes we come up against resistance, right? I'm not a math person. I'm not a reader. I can't do science. Let's think outside of those traditional subject areas and let's focus on what you can do. And you can probably do a lot more than what you realize once we let go of our fixedness on curriculum content, and instead we honor that curriculum and those overall expectations, while also integrating student voice and student choice. So that's a lot. I would like to give us all an opportunity to share our thoughts. So I'm going to just like switch out of this screen for a moment, and I'm going to go to my next screen here. So this is one of my favorite tools for live feedback when I'm working with my students. You can see that there's two ways of accessing this survey, this poll. One, you can go to menti.com and enter the code that's up there. And I think Peter's going to put it in the chat for us.
I have.
Thank you so much. And if you have a device on you, you can scan that QR code and join in there. So there are going to be a couple of questions, and you will see the results showing up live on the screen. Our first question is, where are you most comfortable working with integrated curriculum? Are we in that multidisciplinary stage where our projects might involve multiple subjects, but they're still siloed? Are we at that interdisciplinary phase where we are allowing or having a task where the goals come from multiple subject areas? Or are we at the transdisciplinary PBL phase of our journey? And maybe we are not anywhere yet, and that's okay. Right? So if you're not quite comfortable with that integrated curriculum yet, also totally cool. We're all learning always. So I don't know how many people. We've got 35 people, 17, 18. So I'll give everyone a couple more seconds to answer that first question and jump on to this site. It seems like interdisciplinary is where most of us feel most comfortable. And I think that makes a lot of sense. We can make those important and relevant connections for our students. We can pull our learning goals for a specific unit or a specific task from multiple subject areas. But interdisciplinary learning can still be, or is still, more teacher-centric than that transdisciplinary PBL piece, where we are, I don't want to say losing, but sharing a lot of the control of the classroom. And there are many ways or many things that can impact that comfortability, right? Which I guess we'll talk about when we get to challenges. But I'm thinking maybe you have a really challenging group of learners, and they're very busy friends that we have, and maybe giving up control is, or a little bit of control is terrifying, because I've had those groups before where I'm like, no, PBL, I don't know if it's gonna work with you guys, because we'll see. But it does seem interdisciplinary is where most of us are comfortable, which is fantastic. It's a great start. So if we go to the next slide, what you'll see is, just based on the whirlwind of information I just gave you, or your own experiences, what are some of the benefits that you could see to integrating curriculum? Please feel free to just share like what you think it might be a general benefit, or if you have like a success story that you want to share, please also feel free to do that. Student engagement, yeah, definitely. More bang for your buck. I love that. It is a little bit selfish, right? We are so pressed for time um, as educators, right? There's so much to get through. There's so much we want the students to learn. It might almost kind of sometimes feel like cheating when you're putting expectations together and, you know, doing more than one thing at a time. Oh, these are great answers. Learning becomes intrinsic when it's real world and not abstract. Yeah, I think that's super important and something that I'll address more when we talk more about PBL. But having real world meaningful learning experiences is huge. Yes, the English language curriculum is a chameleon. Great metaphor. It does align really well with almost every subject area. I think that you could easily integrate it into any subject area. That said, I think it is important to, I guess what I don't want this session to be is like, she's telling us that, we don't have to give time to language instruction and literacy instruction. That's not, that's not what I'm saying. I think it's really important to honor time for language and literacy, but where we can, make it something that we give formative feedback or formative assessment on like everything we do. Pressed for time, interest, engagement, real world problems. Literacy in the real world does not exist in a vacuum. Yes. Student engagement, authentic learning. Oh, I love these answers. Thank you so much for sharing. These are beautiful. I'm going to go to the next piece now, which is challenges. So if you are currently integrating curriculum, or if you imagine yourself integrating curriculum, what are some of the challenges that you've encountered or that you imagine you might encounter? Entry points for different students, reporting for strands. Yeah. Time is what people say. People are right. It is a heavy investment of time at the start. Rotary is another challenge for grades and schools that are doing Rotary. That is also a problem in secondary, right? Where you are teaching a single subject and you only have what, like 80 minutes, 75 minutes. But there are ways to make connections still, I think. IEPs and spec ed, yep. Poor attendance is a good one, yeah. Our report card is subject-based, absolutely. Isn't this English class? Why are we reading about the government? Oh my goodness. Why are we reading about anything? Why books? Vastly different learners, yep. Resistance from colleagues, lack of resources. Yeah, these are all like absolutely real, concrete concerns and roadblocks in some instances, right? Some might be stumbling blocks, but others, I think are really difficult to overcome. And so hopefully we can come up with a couple of strategies together, even if, we wanted to just kind of start doing this or dip a foot in the water. Okay. But thank you so much for sharing those concerns and those challenges with me, and with each other, right? I think it's really helpful to acknowledge that whenever we want to try to do something cool as educators, we're always going to face challenges from students, from other educators. It's important to recognize that.
Just a quick comment to everyone. Feel free to drop questions in the chat, and then I'll collect them all up, and then we'll ask them at the end.
Thank you. So to kind of, I kind of pre-answered my own questions, summarizing. Benefits of integrated curriculum. Studies, research has shown that it does enhance student understanding because connections between those subject areas help students retain more information in multiple ways, right? So they're thinking about information differently and are therefore better to able retain it, or able to better retain it if they're thinking about something in multiple ways. Increased engagement and motivation when we have lessons and tasks that have the potential to be more meaningful and relevant to our students with various interests. Development of transferable skills, which is now in our language curriculum, and promotion of global awareness, specifically if we are using a PBL approach. Students can approach a problem, a big question, a driving question from multiple perspectives and have that authentic, real life problem that they're seeking to solve. And integrated curriculum does, we identified this as a challenge, right? Entry points for diverse learners, but integrated curriculum can help support and create entry points for diverse learners and can encourage students to show their learning in multiple ways, in a way that is best suited for them. So if you have a student who is artistically inclined, right, but maybe not mathematically inclined, then their project, their focus might be something from the arts. If you have a student who is more mathematically inclined, then maybe they're working with statistics or graphs, tables, charts, right? And so that is why time and really knowing curriculum kind of act as challenges to integrated curriculum delivery, because we kind of have to be jugglers, right? We may have students working on different things at different times. Challenges, time constraints, right? Big upfront commitment for developing projects and making those curriculum connections. And then, of course, there is pressure to cover curriculum, all of our curriculum, and we may be feeling that pressure from our administration, some like really intensely. Schools are traditionally subject siloed. We may not have the resources to implement projects, and the assessment question, right? If my students are all working on something different, or if we're doing a project, how do I make sure that I have evidence of learning in multiple subject areas? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and give some examples of that. Okay, but specifically looking at strategies for integrating literacy. So taking our language period, right, or our English period, whatever we may have, and thinking of how we can make connections or tasks that are rich in curriculum connections, right? Maybe we reimagine the novel study, right? So if we are doing a whole class novel study, right, maybe we move to a whole class read aloud, and we can there model and share reading guided discussion on character, themes, literary elements of a text. So we are modeling that. And then what are the students reading? They are reading self-selected texts, right? So rather than a whole class novel study, we are having book clubs or literature circles, which can be a very valuable tool when we're thinking about how we can integrate various subject areas into language, into literacy. So for example, you might have students who are reading The Book Thief. Great book, beautiful book. You can take those grade 7 and 8 historical thinking concepts or practices, so cause and consequence, historical significance, historical perspective. I can't remember the other ones off the top of my head, but you can take those and then have the students examine both primary and secondary sources related to World War II and the Holocaust. So you're hitting your history expectations. You are hitting your language expectations together. Okay. Students can also then collaborate, this is a big one, to write their own historical fiction narratives. So giving them that option of, well, maybe you're not interested in World War II, right? Maybe you're not interested in Canadian history. Maybe you're interested in the American Revolution, right? Can you take those historical thinking concepts that we've learned about, right? Can you take learning through primary and secondary historical sources? Can you use reliable sources to research? Can you creatively express a story, tell a story? Can you use the elements of literature and literary devices to construct a historical fiction narrative that is well researched and also true to the form and genre that you are writing for? And then if you don't want to give them that choice and you want to say, sorry, it has to be a historical fiction piece based on Canadian history, then you can do that too, right? You don't have to give them all of the choice in the world. It would really depend on your group. Vocabulary is another place where we can really jump in and make cross-curricular or integrated curricular connections. So we read widely and we intentionally select keywords for our students. And we allow them to intentionally select keywords as well. Vocabulary in any subject area is an important predictor of comprehension across subject areas, right? But rather than giving our students a vocabulary list at the start of a unit and having them just look at Google and say, this is what osmosis is, or this is what a structure is, or this is what a pulley is, right? Like, could we modify a vocabulary activity to have students read widely and build their own graphic organizer for their vocabulary, right? Read this article, right? Read this text. What are the important words in that text, right? Read this section of even just like a science textbook, right? If you move away from science textbooks, read this nonfiction article. Right? Read this little paragraph of information that I have written for you. And then tell me, what are the key words? What do they mean? And why are they important words, right? How did those words shape your understanding or the meaning of the text? And then we can design tasks to encourage the use of key vocabulary in our discussion and in our writing. So one of the curriculum expectations in language, in that oral communication strand, strategies for reading or listening, I can't remember what it's called, is about integrating proper or correct or appropriate word choice and appropriate vocabulary in multiple contexts. So we can have a class discussion as a formative assessment or even as a summative assessment. And we can see our students using the vocabulary words, right? Are they able to define, recognize the importance of, use correctly in context these vocabulary terms? And we can do that across our subject areas. And then, of course, right, subject-specific literacy. So anytime that we are introducing a text in a classroom setting outside of like the language classroom, I think it is important to emphasize content-specific literacy strategies. So when is it appropriate to summarize something? It might not always be. When is it appropriate to question what you're reading? When is it appropriate to make predictions or make connections? So very consciously taking those things that we ask our students to do when they are reading novels or short stories and asking them to do what is appropriate, what strategies are appropriate when they're reading other things as well. And not just when they're reading nonfiction or newspaper articles in language class, but instead when they are reading something from the science book, right? Or when they are watching a documentary or YouTube video in history or geography class, right? When sometimes, you know, when we're doing our ecosystems unit, I show my class clips from Planet Earth, and that's a text, right? So how can I have them, I'll pause and I'll say, okay, what do you think is going to happen to that poor little ant that is going along right now? Make a prediction, right? What evidence are you using, right? And that can be evidence from the text, right? Oh, the music, or oh, the narration, but it can also be scientific evidence, right? Like, oh, well, in an ecosystem, this is what happens, blah, 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 right? And so those predictions can happen in both ways. And then we can also encourage a wider range of writing tasks to establish clear connections between language as a subject area and our other subject areas more generally. So if your students are working on a lab report, emphasize for them the creation of a text is that lab report. That lab report is a text that you are creating. And so those are all under that kind of interdisciplinary bracket where you are having these tasks that hit multiple subject areas and you are making the connections explicit for the students. I mentioned earlier lit circles, book clubs, creating opportunities for students to select texts of interest to them. Literature circles do not have to focus on the novel. So by purposefully selecting and pairing texts, we can look at themes in an overarching or an interdisciplinary way. So for example, one of the books that I offer my students, 7s and 8s, to read is The Marrow Thieves for our literature circles, our book clubs. It's just one option. Those students who are reading The Marrow Thieves are also encouraged to read the poem The Farm by Sherman Alexie. Oops, there should not be a second quotation mark there. And excerpts from a nonfiction science text, The Brain, All About Our Nervous System and More. There's connections there if you've read The Marrow Thieves. And excerpts from The Sixth Extinction, which is also a science / current events type text. So by reading these texts alongside each other, we're exposed to different kinds of literature and writing in different subject areas. Scientists write. Okay, I'm gonna actually, for the sake of time, kind of skip over how I implement literature circles in my class, but this is going to be shared with you as well as all of my Lit Circles resources. And I very much do welcome questions. You can email me. My email is at the end of the thing if you wanted to talk more about Lit Circles, but I do want to honor your time. So I am going to skip forward here. Okay, PBL. Project-based learning is where we move away from that interdisciplinary approach to integrated curriculum, and we move into that transdisciplinary approach where a project, a single task, and it is a large task, it's a project task, has many applications, many curriculum applications, and many skill applications as well. It actively engages students in real-world learning and personally meaningful projects. This video was shared at a workshop that was run by the STEAM consultant and itinerants at my school board, this particular video, and I loved it so much that I wanted to share it with you as well, because it does a great job of explaining the benefits of project-based learning in a way that is also kind of anecdotal, not just research-based. So I'm going to share this video with
you. Project-based learning in less than 5 minutes. So this is me in the 8th grade. I was a combination of shy and nerdy. My whole goal was to remain invisible. I had one friend, this kid named Matt. We were 2 nerds in a pod. And fortunately for me, he had perfect attendance until one day he didn't. He was sick, and it wasn't a big deal, but I stood in the cafeteria looking out at the sea of students, hoping someone would invite me over. But it didn't happen. I hid in the boys' restroom for the next 24 minutes. But it worked. I was invisible. But not to Mrs. Smoot or Mr. Darrow. They knew me. They knew I cared about social justice and baseball and history, and so they invited me to do a History Day project. And although it was fun, it was also terrifying. I had to plan my entire project and track my own progress. I had to figure out what questions to ask and where to find the answer. I had to narrow down the topic to something I cared about. In this case, Jackie Robinson and the integration of baseball. I wrote letters to newspapers and made phone calls to former players. I remember picking up the phone, my hands trembling as I read aloud my pre-recorded script and waited for the stranger to respond. I eventually worked on a slide presentation. That's when the most nerve-wracking moment occurred. I sat in a radio studio and I heard the script that I had just recorded, and I hated it. I'm not doing it, I said. But Mrs. Smoot looked me in the eyes and said, when you hide your voice, you rob the world of your creativity. And so I continued. I went ahead and I shared it with my class. And then I entered the district competition and the state competition and eventually went to Washington, D.C. And although I didn't realize it at the time, Mrs. Smoot was why I became an educator. This project helped me grow into a creative thinker and problem solver. And that experience is why I ultimately embraced project-based learning as a teacher. Now, I want to point something out. Project-based learning is different from simply a traditional classroom project. Project-based learning involves learning through projects rather than doing culminating projects. It involves student choice in design instead of just following a set of instructions. It includes student inquiry rather than pre-planned questions. It includes peer and self-assessment rather than only relying on teacher assessment. And it includes student ownership of the process rather than just teacher ownership of the process. The Buck Institute identifies the following 7 project design elements. Number 1, challenging problem or question. It has to start with something that truly engages students to solve a problem. Number 2, sustained inquiry. They needed the time to ask questions and explore the answers and engage in meaningful research. Number 3, authentic. It has to feel real to the students and tie into an actual context. Number 4, student voice and choice. They need to be the ones designing the entire project the entire time. Number 5, reflection. There needs to be frequent reflection along with a final reflection at the end. Number 6, critique and revision. Students need to engage in peer critique and constant iterative revision. And number 7, public product. They need to launch their work to an authentic audience. Now note that project-based learning can work in tandem with other pedagogical models such as inquiry-based learning, design thinking, and problem-based learning. But the key idea remains the same, that students are engaged in meaningful projects, and through that, they learn at a deeper level.
All right. So that, again, I think is a great overview of the goals of PBL and really what it is trying to do for us is center student voice, center student choice, and really give students an opportunity to create something meaningful. So I have up here a few pieces of project-based learning or a few examples of project-based learning that I've had students engage in. I'm going to kind of start, I'm going to go chronologically actually with this picture up here of our students planting. So I had students express an interest in doing some authentic learning around Indigenous plants, right? So we had talked about the three sisters, and these students wanted to learn about plants that were native to Ontario, and we kind of combined that learning anyways with pollination or pollinators and ecosystems. Anyways, students took this project on. And again, my question is, what do my students need to know in order to complete this project? What do I want them to have at the end of this? And so I told them, I said, okay, we're going to have language connections. We're going to have math connections. We're going to have science connections. Can you make them? And they did. So they wrote a proposal to our principal about putting a pollinator garden on the school property. So they wrote a proposal to our principal, justifying why they wanted to do this. They also wrote letters asking for donations from local businesses to help support the building of our pollinator garden. They researched and decided what plants they would want to put in there. They found the dimensions of the garden and they plotted it out on a grid, how they would plant things. And then they went out there, they planted it, they tended it. And then they also taught our younger students about the material. So they were able to do this. And now, this was 2 years ago, we now have students every year going out there and expanding the garden. So at first it was just a pollinator garden. Now we also have a vegetable garden, which came out of our health unit on healthy eating, right? And food security in geography. So that was, how can we expand on our garden in order to show our learning about food security and healthy food. Last year, I had 2 students. So I do passion projects with my students, which is really just exactly what it sounds like. They choose the project, right? And then I help them set their goals and make it happen. And I help them make those curriculum connections. So these 2 girls decided to design and sell earrings. So they wanted to make their own little business. They work on them for 4 months. It's a significant chunk of time, right? And if I'm giving them that much time, I need to get something significant out of it. So their process work allowed me to take a look at their investigation and communication skills, their scientific research process. So what materials are you using? Are they safe for human skin? How do you know? when you're actually making the earrings, are you using health and safety procedures properly to make your earrings? They created a business model. So language assessment there, they were creating a text, and they created a budget. So that's financial literacy right there. They did code their own business website using HTML code to sell their earrings on their website. They designed them using, so they had to sketch them and they had to 3D model them. So using various tools to show their work. And then they gave an oral presentation about their whole process and their work. Over here, I had students who wanted to do a Christmas arts market. So again, they had to write the proposal to the principal. They had to gather materials. They had to budget, right? So I said, okay, like I'll put up some money for this if you guys want to do this, but you're going to have to show me a very clear budget. And then once that money comes in, right, once you sell these things, what are we doing with that money? Can we budget it to go to a charitable organization? Can we budget some to go back into our school community, right? And then this is a project that I currently have ongoing where I have a group of students, grade 8 students, who are taking old dresses, tearing them down and redesigning them. So a lot of STEAM skills or STEM skills in there, art skills as well. They will be doing a presentation, so that oral presentation piece. They are also researching fashion from different eras and using the historical thinking concepts to research fashion in different areas or eras. And fun fact, they are going to be sewing lights into these dresses, and they have to code each dress to have a particular light show within it. So they're using, well, they're using different things. They're using microbits, which is block coding, and then some of them are using Arduino. So they are using Python. And again, it's based on their comfortability with those different coding technologies. So these are just like a couple of examples of PBL that I've experienced in the last couple of years. How do I assess? So I told you that I help the students once they kind of decide what their project is. I help them come up with where in their project. So like, here are the steps we're going to take. And then as they're kind of coming up with here's step 1, here's step 2, here's what we want to accomplish. I'm like, oh, hey, that's this. Oh, hey, that's this. And if I don't see that, right, if I don't see the connections, then gently I prod them and say like, hey, why don't you try it this way? And then I know that I can get something accessible out of it. But, oh no. There we go. I do want to say that a huge part of PBL is having to have embraced going gradeless. That's a whole other conversation and a whole other hour and a half workshop that we could talk about. But this is the progress scale that I use. So once students have their project ideas, I go through with them what curriculum expectations their project is hitting. Right? So I sit down with each student or each group of students and I say, okay, here are the curriculum expectations that your project is going to be touching on. Let's make learning goals together out of those curriculum expectations. We do that. And then they measure their achievement based on this scale of mastery, excelling, almost getting it, beginning to get it, and intervene, which is like, oh my gosh, help me. And they give examples of how their work, how their process work, how they're going through this project shows that they are at that level for that learning goal. I keep a tracker the same way, and we touch base every so often to make sure that we're all on the same page. And like, I'd say 95% of the time, we're on the same page. I'm going to skip over that. But what I really wanted us to get to was this opportunity for us to start brainstorming meaningful driving questions for a PBL experience that emphasizes literacy. So there has to be like a literature connection or a literacy connection in there. This is where I'm hoping that we can go. So we start with our big idea or our driving question for our project in the middle. And then we sort of branch out and say, okay, what is one subject area that is being touched on by this big question, or could possibly be touched on by this big question? What is a learning goal or an expectation, a curriculum expectation in that subject area? What's another subject area, another learning goal or subject expectation? If there's a third subject area or multiple learning goals or expectations, great. And then what are 3 to 4 critical takeaways, skills, or pieces of knowledge that we want students to take away from this, from working with this big question? So do feel free to ask questions now or take off. Thank you so much for coming. And you can shoot me an email at any time.
Mhm.
About anything, about this, about anything,
So
really.
some of the questions that came up, one was, is there a scale implying proficiency from beginner to advanced, like from multi to transdisciplinary? So is there any sort of a verbal scale?
A scale of levels of integrating curriculum?
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily call it like a scale, because I think that's almost like hierarchical. It's more of a continuum, right? And on some days for some tasks, you're going to end up being more transdisciplinary, and on other days for other tasks, you're going to be multidisciplinary. And some days you're going to be like, no, I'm standing at the front of the class and I'm teaching you. And that's I think the way to approach it, as opposed to kind of looking at you in your, having to do one of those things.
Yeah. I think in my personal experience, like when I got into teaching, I was actually recruited by a principal. I was working in industry and I met him at a meeting and he liked my approach. I actually kind of told him off about education. And my philosophy was really kind of PBL based. And they didn't call it that in those days, but that was the approach that I thought all teachers should use. And he actually recruited me into teaching without having been a teachers college yet. And anyway, but I find some administrators, they don't like this approach often because it's not formalized and it's difficult to administer and track. Like for instance, it goes right into the next question. How do you track which expectations were touched upon? Now, if it's, if it's just PBL, if it's teacher-based PBL, as opposed to student-centered or student-based PBL, where they're coming up with the projects. So if it's student-centered or teacher-centered, it's easy to administer it and write lesson plans. If it's student-centered, you may not know what you're doing in any one day, right? Students might decide to go off on this tangent, and then, how do you track that, right?
Yeah. And I think that that's why, sitting down and talking learning goals with your students and tailoring learning goals for their specific work is important. And making sure that I think for me, one of the biggest learning experiences with PBL was not everyone's going to have the same learning goals, and achieving those learning goals is going to look different for everyone.
Especially if it's team-based. Like you put together a team of 4, you could have students doing very different things within the team. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's very much accepting that there's going to be an individualized approach for everyone.
Okay, next
right.
question.
And then you do need to have a supportive admin though. Like that's key, right? And you also kind of have to know your curriculum.
Yeah. Or an administrator that just doesn't care because they know you're doing good things.
Yes.
There's no complaints. You're not sending anybody to the office. That's always a good
Yep.
of how
Right.
well
And invite your admin to come in and
yes,
like
absolutely.
see what's happening,
How
because I
engaged they
think
are.
sometimes,
Yeah.
yeah, right, they may not know what you're talking about. Let them come in and see it.
Yeah, that's very true. The next question was, how do you cope with summer vacation and the garden's needs?
Oh, that's a great question. I give grade 8 students who have just graduated volunteer hours to come back and take care of it over the summer,
It's a
because they can start collecting volunteer hours after they graduate.
towards their 40 hours. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Matt asked, you mentioned being gradeless. Is your board gradeless, or how do you meet the expectations of growing success and writing report cards?
Yeah, so Matt and I chatted a little bit about this in the breakout rooms, but it bears repeating for those of you who are not in the breakout room and for those of you who are watching the recording at a later date. My board is not gradeless. And I mean, I think everybody should be gradeless, but it's fine. Again, I have a very supportive administrator who, I spent kind of like a summer preparing and reading all of the books on grading and coming up with how I was going to do it. And I went in, in August and I said, this is what I want to do. And here's how I'm going to do it. Here's how I'm going to collect evidence. Here's how I'm going to communicate with parents and guardians. Um, So I had all of my T's crossed and my I's dotted, which again, this kind of thing, PBL, ungrading, it takes a lot of upfront preparation, but it is really like a time saver as the year progresses,
Mhm.
right? And so my administrator said yes, and I went ahead and I did that. I do student conferencing, so every student has their learning goals. And they use their own sort of achievement scale to say, am I mastering this? Am I excelling in this? Do I need intervention in this? And we sit down and we talk, and I give a lot of formative assessment.
Mhm.
Um, Conversation, a lot of just kind of quick written notes, check-ins with the students.
Mhm.
And then at the end of the process, they have a portfolio. They have like a digital or physical portfolio where they've kept all of their progress work, including their own tracking sheets of how they're reaching their learning goal, and my own tracking, because I'll give them my, like, here are my observations of you, and that I just scribbled down today. And then they sit down and I sit down with them and we talk about, well, do you feel like you achieved your goals?
Mhm.
What would you give this project as a science project? What would you give this project as a language project?
Mhm.
And very often they have a good sense
Mhm.
of it, um, because I think they're more self-aware than we give students credit for sometimes.
Mhm.
Um,
And they're often more critical of themselves than you are of them.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And feedback that I've gotten has been like, it's really cool to not have to stress out about a grade,
Mhm.
right? That I can do this project, I can enjoy learning, um, but I don't have to worry like, oh, am I losing a point for this? Or am I losing a point for that?
Mhm. Now, do you,
So.
do you ever ask, what mark do you feel this deserves? And they tell you, oh, 70%. And then you ask them why.
Yes,
And then,
right. And they're generally able, but I kind of don't phrase it like that.
okay.
I say, okay, so this is your product. If you had more time,
Mm,
what would you do differently?
that's a good approach.
How could you make this better?
Mhm.
And that's kind of where they reveal, or where they think about like,
Mhm.
oh, well, yeah, I guess I could make this better. Like, I guess I could do this differently. Um,
Yeah, that's
and I find that that's a really productive conversation to have with them.
that's mastery at its finest.
Hmm.
And then if you give them the extra time, they get the marks.
Yep. Right.
Yeah.
And then I have done that before where they will submit a product.
Mhm.
I will, grade that product
Mhm.
in that I give it formative feedback, and I don't actually put a grade on it.
Mhm.
Um,
Oh, why not? If they've done the work.
Yeah. Well, I give it back. I say, this is my feedback.
Mhm.
You can hand this back to me
Yeah.
and I will give it the grade that I have in mind.
Yeah.
Or you can look at this feedback,
Uh-huh.
you can integrate the feedback and then
Ah,
give it back and I will
right.
regrade it, because I
Right.
feel like sometimes they don't read the feedback,
Right.
right? They just look at the mark. So if
Right.
you're making them read the feedback and then decide, do I want to put the
Yes.
work in or not,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You kind of already know what mark you're going to give it.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, full disclosure, like I still do math tests, I still do science tests, like I do actual like grading in my class, just not for project-based learning.
This has been excellent. I'm glad to see that somebody believes in PBL as much as I did when I was still teaching. It's wonderful, and you did a great job of it.
Thanks, Peter.